Welcome to Season 2, Episode 4 of The Reading Cure. In this episode, we'll be discussing the book Civilisation and its Discontents by Sigmund Freud. Welcome to The Reading Cure, where great books and great ideas are what we like to prescribe. My name is Dr. Stephen Davis, and my co-host is Dr. Alexander Fox. So in this episode, we'll be discussing Civilisation and its Discontents by the iconic founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud. This short book, published in 1930, is a thought-provoking exploration of the inherent conflict between individual instincts and the demands of society. Freud delves into the depths of the human psyche here, revealing how our primal desires clash with the constraints of civilization. He contends that the pursuit of happiness is intricately linked with the suppression of these instincts, leading to a perpetual state of discontent. Through a psychoanalytic lens, Freud offers us profound insights into the perennial struggle for inner peace within the framework of modern society. Okay, Alex, so our first question about this book, Civilisation and its Discontents, was, so Freud is obviously making the claim here that the tool that we've created to relieve our suffering in life, civilization itself, may have become one of the greatest causes of our suffering. So the first question really was, why might that be, and do you think he's right?
Yeah, well, from my understanding, reading that short book, Freud's main argument for why it causes suffering in some kind of way is to do with his notion of the pleasure principle, that idea that we're fundamentally hedonistic and we look for instinctual gratification. That is the core of our being. And in his view, civilization protects us in some ways. It allows us to have a more secure existence, but the heavy existential penalty of that is that our instincts do not get gratified as much and as intensely as what we would in a more so-called primitive state of being. So it is this real trade-off that we get to live or exist for longer, and there is some instinctual gratification, there is some pleasure, but it is not as intense or as direct as it would be in the, state of nature as he would see it. So I think that's what I took as his, most fundamental criticism, or at least his most fundamental point about the difficulties of civilization, that it causes suffering in that regard, that we're more frustrated than what we would be otherwise. But on the other hand, we do exist in a more secure kind of way together, working together for common aims.
Yes, I think that really kind of captures it nicely there, Alec. I think you're right. I mean, obviously, to understand Freud's perspective, this point about the pleasure principle is key, actually, because, as you said, really for him, happiness, as far as he would define it, is just fulfilling our natural instinctual impulses in some capacity. So, as you said, the dangers that we face in that, that could stop that happening, illness, natural disasters, these various things, and also other human beings themselves. Obviously there's a degree of protection that comes from being in society, but yes, I mean, obviously the price that's paid is a lot of these desires simply can't be satisfied because they're of an antisocial nature in some capacity. So yeah, obviously for Freud, that is a problem for us. That will mean we experience quite a lot of frustration, or even more, what he would call, I guess, neurotic suffering within that society. Yeah.
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, the civilization is both friend and foe. It is both an ally and an adversary in his view. So, and this also goes with that notion of the reality principle. That we have to accommodate to reality to some extent to get our instincts satisfied.
Yes.
But reality has a somewhat antagonistic element because it is an obstacle to the satisfaction of our instincts. And civilization itself is, allows us to satisfy, but it also frustrates, really. So, it's quite a nuanced point. It's friend and foe, really. It's not one or the other. And I could imagine that for, for quite a lot of people, they would see civilization, in terms of progress as an unmitigated good,
Yes.
really. So Freud was definitely going against that with maybe a more nuanced reading of what civilization is and what it does to us there.
I completely agree. I mean, I think it is nuanced because, I mean, if I'm reading him correctly, obviously, as you said, in terms of the reality principle, then that is, where the ego, the more self-aware, rational part of us can, to some extent, accommodate itself to delaying these gratifications or even renouncing certain ones, but, on the basis of more of a long-term or a sublimated satisfaction, where the desires are maybe, they evolve into a different kind of satisfaction, maybe something like art or
Yes.
and so on. But at the same time, so we can get that through being socialized, which is to some extent positive. But there's also the point, isn't there, that if the socialization is too severe or repressive, then in a way that reality principle stage is actually quite undermined. People end up with more, it's the what he calls the superego part that's really dominating and persecuting, actually, and the ego isn't as strong as it might have been under a less punitive kind of socialization. I mean, I
And
know.
I think you're right that if the superego is too punitive, then we have neurosis, and so there is an attempt to get instinctual satisfaction through symptoms. This more
Yeah.
circuitous, roundabout route. And I think Freud would say that we would all be neurotic to some extent. That the only people that weren't neurotic would be the ones that were outright psychotic.
Yep.
And you can see the antagonism between the pleasure and reality principles at its most stark in the psychotic, because the psychotic, according to Freud, is someone that is renounced reality
Yeah.
and has gone completely for wishful, delusional fantasies. So that is the tension between the two at its most, strong. But with neurosis, there is some accommodation to reality, but there is also an accommodation to these instincts that can't be satisfied or even acknowledged, as you said, because of the superego.
Yes.
There. So the superego won't really allow them to even be acknowledged and maybe diverted into a more productive form. So they come out more in this spontaneous, seemingly senseless way as symptoms. And it was part of the Freudian hermeneutic to interpret these symptoms and make sense of them. And that's what he attempted to do.
Yeah,
The,
because I guess, I mean, obviously, the kind of, the time he was writing in, he kind of, I guess, he born in sort of the Victorian type era, obviously not in the UK, but, the kind of morality prevailing in Europe at that time, much more puritanical, so obviously he was seeing a lot of clients who, had undergone a lot, had really felt compelled to repress a lot of their instincts. And this was, what I guess partly influenced his view about neurosis, these kind of particularly sexual instincts that were having to be renounced
well,
for,
yes,
propriety and so on, so that obviously was leading to people coming to him with really severe superegos. And And of course, what happens, if I understand him rightly, is that because they've also repressed their aggressive instincts as well as their sexual instincts, that this aggressive energy is what charges the superego, but is directed back upon themselves. So they're quite in quite a tortured state actually by this kind of level of kind of socially imposed repression that they're having to live with.
Yeah, that is right. Yeah, as I understood it too, that the symptoms are a covert expression of the libidinal instincts. For Freud, the paradigm instinct, the key instinct is eros, the sexual
Yes.
drive. Everything else is somewhat understood as, with the exception of aggression anyway. But anything that like art and so on, and love itself, more romantic love would be seen as a derivative of the sexual drive. And this is maybe one of the criticisms we could make of Freud's view, is that it does seem to be reductionistic. It's libido and aggression. These are the
Yes.
two, the life and death instinct. So and as you say, the aggressive side is redirected, or as Gestalt therapists would say, reflected, turn back on oneself, which creates this, according to Freud, this punitive, superego. So yes, we don't get our sexual desires, gratified in a direct way,
Yep.
which causes frustration and may actually lead to symptoms. But also our innate aggression is not expended directly, and can actually be turned back on the self and lead to this punitive superego with quite persecutory guilt. And so, yes, I mean, it kind of creates this idea that the modern individual is somewhat caged by civilization, and it's a cage that allows the human animal to exist longer than what it would, as he sees it, in a kind of state of nature.
Yes.
But it is also tamed and sick, really. So it's a little bit like Nietzsche. I'm sure that Freud was heavily influenced by Nietzsche,
Yes.
and would see. I think he's influenced a lot by Nietzsche in this idea that morality is a sickness, and so I suppose this leads on to what we were talking about, or what you were asking originally, and to what extent is Freud right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I mean, of course, I think he has a point that that we can be frustrated, our drives can be frustrated, that our aggression may not have directly expended as it would originally, at least allegedly, and that
Mhm.
can lead to this sort of persecutory guilt. I'm sure most people feel that their inner critic, as it's called now,
Yeah.
rather than superego, is usually harsh. So I
Yep.
think that Freud seems to be on quite solid ground when we look at why we might have a harsh, superego, or harsh inner critic.
Yeah.
But I mean, where there are problems, I think, in his account is this assumption that happiness is pleasure, that really pleasure is the one thing that we're looking for,
Yep.
and that hedonism is entirely our innate nature. It seems to me to be overlooking some things, because he doesn't really talk about meaning, like a meaningful life, Freud.
Yeah.
I mean, I did not encounter that language at all in this book. And I think in general, Freud did not engage much with that. And to be fair, if you read any modern philosophy book about meaning in life, they make quite a sharp distinction between pleasure and meaning,
Yeah.
because they're definitely not the same. I mean, we could think about meaningful lives, like, say, Franz Kafka's life, which was very creative and meaningful, because he was a great artist, but he was quite miserable in
Yeah.
many ways.
Yep.
And so the thing is that meaning obviously, if your life has meaning and pleasure, then that is greater than meaning and misery.
Yes.
But Freud doesn't seem to acknowledge that one of the gains of civilization is that we can do fulfilling things that aren't always or even mainly meaningful. He
Yeah.
would probably just see it as some kind of sublimation, as he sees it, of the sexual drive. If somebody was involved in a moral cause,
Yeah.
say,
Yeah.
which might not be pleasant. In fact, it could be miserable but highly meaningful. And yeah, civilization does open us up to pleasure and meaning, and that was something that I don't really think he saw. And my second main criticism, I think, is that when we read Civilization, its discontents, I don't know if you felt this, but so much of how Freud describes our psyche is what we've appropriated. It's almost like the Freudian way of thinking about our psyches has just become part of the psyche's furniture. That
Hmm.
it's not. I'm sure when it first came out, that book and the Freudian Revolution before it, that it would have seemed particularly striking. Now, some of it actually seems like common sense,
Yes.
really. But I think, like for me, where I see a real weakness in his account is this notion that morality is something that is internalized from external to the self. It is what we appropriate, introject, as they say in psychoanalysis. Now, of course, things like moral rules and norms, we may just take them in from our culture
Yeah.
and they become part of our superego. That definitely happens. But what he seemed to really overlook was that morality could be an integral part of who we are, and that our moral being can be part of our integrated self. In other words, there may be a conflict at times, and everybody can recognize this, I'm sure, between what they want to do pleasure wise and what they think is right. There
Yep.
could be a conflict there. What he's describing there is not unheard of, but he never seems to consider the cases where pleasure and morality confuse together, or where the self may actually renounce the pleasure because morality is an integral part of who they are
Yeah.
and not just something that they've had to submit to. He's got this idea that morality is a disease. It's something that we've succumbed to and we submit to. He doesn't see it as enabling or potentiating or a way of growing as an individual.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, I think, as you sort of said earlier, I mean, because ultimately there is this reductionistic kind of assumption there, where there's eros, there's libidinal energy that he feels is anything higher is a sublimated form of that. Then, in a way, that doesn't seem to really suggest there's any there's too great or significant value on these higher interests that people have. It's a sort of almost feels like a kind of consolation for something more instinctual that they would rather be doing, that would be more pleasurable. And obviously when
Yeah.
his definition of happiness simply is the gratification of desires, whether it be in a sublimated form or not. So yeah, I agree. I mean, for me, reading it, the absence of really the issues of meaning and purpose kind of coming into the discussion did seem like a bit of a glaring omission. And yeah, I
I
mean,
think
obviously
so.
civilization does provide so many more opportunities for meaning in that regard.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think he's on quite this notion of sublimation. Obviously had to, if he was going to talk about the primacy of the libido, he had to explain humanity's artistic and scientific pursuits as sublimations. Like a refinement of that sexual drive. Now, to me, I think this sounds highly contrived. The notion that, say, Einstein coming up with his theory of relativity is a rerouting of his sexual drive.
Yeah.
How you go from Einstein's libido to the theory of contemplating the theory of relativity and deriving it, seems like I don't know how you go from one quite to the other. And
Yeah.
Freud never spells out in any credible way how that sort of derivation is meant to work. It has to work for his system,
Yeah.
but it just seems highly contrived to me.
Well, I mean, again, I was thinking back to some of the people we've discussed previously, like Frankl and Maslow, who have more, the more kind of sense that there's this range of needs or instinctual, wishes to be satisfied that we have that are, they're not, there are the more bodily, but there are others, and I don't know why human beings having a bit more of a spectrum of higher and lower desire, lower if you want to call it, in terms of sexual desires, all the way up to scientific thinking and so on. I don't know why actually they need all be reduced to one particular underlying type of instinct, but
No,
obviously
I
that's
mean, he obviously liked. He probably thought that the more that you could derive psychological phenomenon from a number, a small number of fundamental, forces, as it were, the more
yeah,
scientific it was in a way,
sure,
the more unified the theory. Because as you would have saw yourself in that book, he uses the word science quite a lot. So
yeah,
he did see psychoanalysis as a science, which is a rare thing to claim now. And of course, whether how much that invalidates psychoanalysis is a big topic, and there's been quite a lot of debate about that. But Freud saw it quite straightforwardly as a science, and
yeah,
and I think that it was probably also his materialism. This idea that the mind is the brain, and the
yeah,
brain is part of the body. So therefore, the drives are influencing the mental because the mental is still part of the body. So he had this materialist understanding of the mind. In other words, he did not think that the mind was, in some regards, categorically different to the body, and therefore one could be subsumed by the other.
sure,
And that's why you would see the drives influencing mental life in the way that they did. And also because he was a materialist, he was focused on causes rather than purposes. So, like the people that you talk about, like Maslow
yeah,
and Frankl, they are people that believed that human intentionality, purpose, was fundamental
yeah,
to our psychology, whereas Freud in his materialism looked at causes. So he didn't look at purpose, really. It did not have a big part in his psychological framework. And that meant, as we were saying earlier on, that he would downplay the role of meaning in
yeah,
life, because meaning is about purpose. It's about, teleology. It's not simply about cause and effect. But to acknowledge that would be to acknowledge a difference between the mind and the brain in a way, because most of the people that advocate a purposefulness to our psychology do see the mind as being different in some ways to the brain.
I
But
think so. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I mean, I thought the first chapter of this book is a little bit strange in a way because he starts off really with almost like an answer to maybe a friend who's
mm,
raised a question about his previous book, which was about religion. So he begins the first chapter really talking about the experience that some people have of a sense of kind of oneness with the universe, and he's very keen to. I mean, he says he can't relate to it at all, but then he kind of wants to
no,
explain it away in terms of that's them regressing to a pre-ego state. But and again, there's quite a sort of mechanistic way of thinking there. I thought,
yeah,
that's just, that really, I mean, obviously, that's a whole other topic. He's very critical of religion. That's something he really wants to, make clear
yes,
that
yeah,
he's not,
yeah,
he
yeah,
thinks, it's not in keeping with reality as he sees it and so on. But yeah,
no,
he's quite,
no,
those kind, say like a kind of more spiritual experience or sublime experience or whatever that, I think it was a friend who was a poet was trying to
mm,
suggest, gives a kind of gives the sort of religious urge in some people that kind of on a more felt level, that was just being chucked out. That wasn't really appropriate. So as you said, it's like there's an over-scientizing, I guess, a little bit here. Or
yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. I mean, Theodor Reich, who was in many ways a devoted disciple of Freud, did say something very interesting about his psychology, that Freud didn't even like music. And the reason that he didn't like music is that he didn't like succumbing to its power without knowing why.
Interesting.
So, you can see that when he talks about these oceanic experiences, this dissolution of the ego temporarily.
Yep.
That Freud did not have that, or didn't even allow himself to have even an everyday experience of that. Like if you listen to music, that the ego boundary might be more expansive in those moments, and you're somewhat submitting to the power of the music. But Freud refused to do that. He actually, he was so much wishing to be in control, you could say, and to understand anything that was happening to him.
Yes.
You could see that such a person would not be open to that kind of experience. So when he says he's never found it in his experience, it doesn't seem like, if Reich is reporting it accurately, that Freud was going to be remotely open to that. In fact, he was rather defended against it.
And it's interesting that obviously he's been acutely aware of the discontentments and frustrations that come from being a kind of isolated individual in a society that is not bending itself to the individual will. But I mean, obviously he's actually overlooking a kind of one of many possible ways to alleviate some of that discomfort, which is a slight loss of ego in, as you said, music or other kinds of sublime type of experiences that would actually
indeed. And this goes to a kind of third criticism that I had of the book, which was that Freud did see us as rather atomistic innately.
Yeah.
So the ego is like this little island that initially has this narcissistic charge to it, but eventually somehow reaches out to other islands through the libido and forms these connections. But the connections are not primary. And this was something that the object relations school of psychoanalysis, Melody Klein, D.W. Winnicott, and so on, fundamentally disagreed with them. And I mean, now what we know about babies and attachment, it's clear that, from the beginning, that we are very much interrelated and connected to other people profoundly. Even in the first weeks and months of life, we are not some atomistic ego, as Freud thought we were. And you might actually think then that when we look at the anecdote about his problems with music, that there is the danger that maybe Freud took his rather defended, isolated ego, his adult defended ego, and interposed that back on how it would be in the first stages of life, and just assumed that we were more shut off and defended than what we are in reality.
Yes.
And this goes to how we then look at civilization, because if you see our origins as being somewhat walled off, then reaching the point of interconnectedness is a bit of a slog, and in some ways there is a kind of renunciation of it. The ego has to renounce its sovereign individuality and power, as Freud saw it. And so civilization then takes on a bit of a problematic tinge. It becomes something that is in some regards, a necessary evil. However, if you see it more from that object relations school, where right from the beginning, particularly with our mothers when we're babies, there is this profound connection that influences our very being, then civilization is kind of there in its raw form.
That's true. And
A
yeah,
society of two.
yeah, yep, but not one in which we are necessarily feeling alienated or distinct,
No,
actually, but one that, yeah, I think that's,
no. And I mean, the thing is that as a general rule, this is something that they discuss in philosophy more than psychology, but it is something that psychologists have to keep in mind when they're forming their theories, which is that if you've got a certain kind of thing and you're trying to explain how it, developed, from its origins, you can't really explain the origin as being fundamentally different. In other words, if we evolve into these intersubjective, connected adult beings, hopefully as mature as we can be, you can't really start off with this walled off, isolated ego, because it's not then clear how one becomes the other. Whereas if you see it in that object relations way, you can see the continuity, the evolution. And I think that's the more credible way to look at it.
yes, I think so. I mean, well, I mean, for example, in the book, obviously he talks about love, as one of the, he looks briefly early on at the various strategies that people use to try to, find some kind of happiness within civilization. And love, obviously, of another person. He kind of describes it as this kind of anomalous experience whereby in that specific instance somehow they don't put their own ego first, and it becomes about another person. But that doesn't really quite fit very well with the rest of the theory in a way. But I guess that, as you were suggesting there, is because he has this kind of a slightly automaton view of what we are and how we form. And then, of course, suddenly, love for another person would seem quite a strange thing to just suddenly manifest from that. But
Well, exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
rather
And
than,
I mean, and I think this relates to something that Anthony Storr, I know we did his book on solitude, but he wrote
yeah.
he wrote a book called Feet of Clay about gurus, and there was a chapter on Freud. And one of the things he said that was insightful about Freud is that Freud could not relate to anyone, in his opinion, as an equal. He either had to be above them as a mentor or guru, or he was like with Fleisch, quite subservient and
Mhm.
submissive and
Yeah.
deferential. So there is that thing that even as great a psychologist as Freud was, that if Storr has a point, it may not be that Freud on a consistent level felt that equality. And therefore, his view of love could be, well, ordinarily you're focused on yourself, but in love, mysteriously you're focused on someone else. And
Yes.
it's almost like a self forgetting. But I think like mature love would be a give and take.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so it might be the case that his psychology influenced how he looked at love too.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think so. I think so. I think that's the thing about this book in a way is that on the one hand, I mean, he acknowledges this himself. Some of what he says is quite, now seems quite commonsensical. Some of the points about an overly severe, say, upbringing and how that can, and these kind of things all seem pretty reasonable. But within all that, he's kind of brought in quite a lot of his own kind of underlying assumptions and actually his personality as well. From what you're describing, that kind of just makes some aspects of it seem a little bit out there, whilst others seem, like about the idea about delaying gratification and becoming, your conscience becoming a bit more, your consciousness, your ego being more able to sort of, seek goals, be more in tune with reality. These kinds of things. That's all actually quite fine, but yeah, there is a lot of other stuff going on here that seems a little bit more hard to quite fathom. And obviously,
Yeah, yeah, and there does seem to be a stoical element to Freud. That he, as I said earlier, with his response to music, that he did not want to submit to anything that he didn't fully understand,
mm,
and so there almost seems like a compulsion to know what is the case, what is reality, to understand things as they are, the reality principle.
yes,
And so it does seem like there was almost a greater renunciation of pleasure in some ways. I mean, the music antidote illustrates that somewhat. But Reich also said that Freud wasn't sexually active after his early 40s because he thought he should redirect the libido to sublimated pursuits, i.e., his own research. But for us that are a bit wary or critical of that notion, it does seem like quite a severe renunciation of pleasure, ironically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, given that he's indeed. I mean, it's like he's writing a book about these inevitable discontentments that civilized living will bring, but at the same time, he is deliberately pushing away certain more possible remedies. Some of them kind of obvious, like we discussed before about the music and the oceanic experience. There's a lot of things being ruled out, and again, why actually being so sublimated and in touch with the reality principle is a better way to live, actually, given his own assumptions about our primary pleasure seeking. Why actually that doesn't quite make sense to me, actually, why to take such a severe kind of stance on that one. But and
yet he did. And I mean, I think also that what I would say about this reality principle is that, okay, I can understand why he would wish to highlight that there could be a conflict between what we wish and what is the case. I mean, that is a fundamental psychological distinction, that anybody that wants to participate in a society should have, that what you wish for and what may be the case in reality may not correspond. It is something that an adult has to recognize in comparison to a young child in some ways. But when he calls it a reality principle, it almost seems like that he's not acknowledging that, well, who says what is reality, and so that there is a kind of obfuscation really there, because then he gives us a sense of what reality is according to Freud.
Yes, that's true.
and it seems quite seamless and organic, but actually, any notion of reality is going to come with umpteen assumptions
Yes.
with it. But he makes it seem like that reality is something that is there just to confront. It's there in front of your eyes. That there is no God. That religion is just bogus. That is his notion of confronting reality.
Yes. Yeah.
But whether he's right or not, there are competing accounts of what reality is, and he hasn't really contended with them.
No, indeed, exactly. I think that's it. He's really has just simply asserted a view there. Certainly not in this book. I mean, obviously, he's written the previous book. I can't remember the title of it, but it came out a couple of years before Civilisation. It's Discontents, and it was about. Was it something about an illusion, the history of an illusion, or something like that? But it was
the future of an illusion.
Future of an illusion. That was the one. Yeah, and obviously that he's maybe made more the argument against religion as he sees it there. He obviously in this one talks, he kind of equates it to the wish of a child to have, the protection of the father, when they realize the dangers of the world, and, kind of creating a sort of fantastical father and the idea of a God and so on. But yeah, he's obviously very disparaging of it and just sees it as utterly inconsistent with, as you said, the reality principle as
I think,
sees it.
Yeah. I mean, this is a side topic, but what I would just say regarding the issue of, the human father as the prototype for God, the Christian God. Obviously, Freud, as a humanist and atheist, would see it that way around, whereas the Christian, I would assume, sees the human father as in the image of their God. You know what I mean? The other way around. And so the thing is that it can be interpreted in different ways. And so the fact that the father and the God are seen to relate does not necessarily mean that we took one, that we did it in the way that Freud suggests it.
No, indeed, and nor. I mean, obviously, he's making the contention that for your average person, as he would have seen it, that's what a god is a sort of imaginary, superpowered father. But I mean, that's not necessarily how any religious person might actually be seeing it. I mean, that's one. It might be true that some do, but I mean, that is a bit of a sweeping.
Well, it is. Well, it is. And I mean, as you know, we'll be covering Mortimer Adler's book, How to Think About God, I think it's called.
Yeah, yeah,
And, when it covers obviously the topic of God as a concept, the idea of the Father doesn't cover everything about the conception of a God.
yeah.
Because we don't see omnipotence as a quality of the human Father.
Sure.
Say.
Yeah, indeed.
So I mean, again, I think that because Freud, being a great psychologist, and the first really modern psychologist, as we would see, understands, he psychologizes things,
Yeah,
and he was not someone that had much of a temperament, it seems, for philosophy. And
yeah,
so maybe he did like Schopenhauer, but overall he didn't seem to have much of a stomach for philosophy from what I've read. So he doesn't seem to understand that the concept of a god is more complicated than this notion of the father, really.
yeah,
And that
yeah,
and that even if that concept is misguided, which is another issue whether it is or not, the qualities that are traditionally seen as characteristics of God, it's hard. Some of them are harder to psychologize than others. With
yeah,
the family anyway.
yeah. In terms of maybe where he was on
Yeah,
a little bit safer ground, as we would see it, I wonder, the second question we were going to look at was, he really emphasizes in this book the problem of guilt, which he sees as a consequence of the repressive influence of civilization on individuals. So I'm wondering, how did he understand this process whereby there's this widespread toxic guilt that people are struggling with within civilized society, and is there anything that could be done about that?
yeah. Well, from what I can gather in this book itself, that he describes the formation of the super ego in two kind of ways. The first one is that the young child craves and needs the authority figure, the parents' love, and the authority figure is to some extent seen as this punitive, aggressive figure.
Yeah.
And what the child does is introjects, takes in, identifies with this authority figure in order to maintain this bond, in order to get love.
Yeah.
So the aggression of the superego, according to this first explanation, is to do with it is like imported aggression from the father figure in the main,
Hmm.
that's taken in, and that becomes the superego. So that's the first explanation. The second one, that he says, is that the child will have aggression towards that parental figure, towards that authority figure. It identifies with the superego, as a way of keeping that love. But the aggression of the superego initially is the aggression that comes from the frustration that the authority figure imposes on the child. So it's like the child's own aggression turned against itself.
Yes.
And he does not think that these two explanations are contradictory or competing. He kind of sees them as one and the same. In other words, the superego is both an identification with the parental figure and also one's own aggression turned against oneself.
Yeah. And am I right in saying, so, the consequence of this process then being that, when the superego, it almost becomes like a sort of internal monitor that will
Yeah,
generate condemnation, which we'll feel as guilt or fear, even when it not only actually when we act in a way that is contrary to how we feel we should be acting, according to
yeah,
the standards that we're trying to follow, but actually simply even having thoughts about acting badly will generate guilt and fear as well, actually. So it could become, or at least a very strict superego in people who've really whether it's internalized these values or really turned their aggression on themselves. Well, yeah, we'll have this superego that is really constantly keeping them in a state of guilt and fear, actually, just because of wishes they might have rather than anything they've actually done.
Mm, mm.
So
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the sort of downsides to civilization, as Freud sees it, because as you say, the superego punishes the ego for even desires or
yeah,
wishes that might never be actually enacted in reality. So it is different to an external authority figure, because an external authority figure can only really punish you, for what you've done, for the deed, because an external authority figure does not know what you're thinking or feeling or wishing in a way
yes,
that your super ego does. But the super ego punishes us as much for the wish as for the deed,
yes,
really. So in that way, it is very strict. I mean, the thing is that modern psychoanalysts they kind of see the Freudian superego as a persecutory superego rather than a reparative superego, and we can get on to that in a minute. I think one of the reasons why it is, well, maybe even the main reason why the Freudian superego is harsh is not only because of the aggression redirected against the self. You would know that Freud would typically give an instinctual, an explanation in terms of instincts.
yeah,
But I think another main reason why it is strict is that it does not really deal with moral reasoning. The
mm,
superego, the Freudian superego is not actually a moral entity in the more mature sense. It does not really morally reason, and a big giveaway of that is that Freud, and this shows how, shall we say, how impoverished his idea of guilt is that he equates guilt with social anxiety, right?
yeah,
So, in other words, the superego is saying this wish is going to lead to an outcome that alienates you from other people, people that matter to you. Now, that could be your family, that could be the wider society, and therefore you can't do it. And also, you're bad for having that wish.
yeah,
But it is social anxiety. It's not really saying it's wrong if it alienates you from the crowd, as
yeah,
it were. But that is not actual moral reasoning, because you can think about scenarios where, say, for example, if you were a German in Nazi Germany and you were tempted to, if we may use that language in that scenario, if you were tempted to help a Jewish person out, your superego could be clamping right down on that, saying how terrible you are as a person, not because what you were going to do was wrong, objectively speaking, but because it's thinking about that social anxiety, that sense of being estranged from the crowd, which in that era would have been Nazi Germany. You can see then that it's not fundamentally correlated with actual morality, but it's the morality of what is done,
yes.
norms.
I mean, it's in, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, because he mentions at one point that, in his analytic work, a common treatment, as he might, that he would have to work with patients on would be trying to lessen the severity of their superego.
Yes,
So he
yeah,
obviously recognized this as a problem, but that it is interesting, isn't it, that there's no sense that this can become a more, as far as I can tell, in reading of Freud, there's no way this superego can kind of mature, and almost like, in the way that the reality principle can maybe, a person can actually become a bit more attuned to reality and the way that they gratify their wishes. Can they become more attuned to reality and perhaps formulate their own moral elements to this superego, so that it becomes more like a conscience as people kind of traditionally understand it. But I'm not really
yeah.
seeing any great possibility for that here. It just seems to be
No,
this.
it didn't seem to be the case. And
Yeah.
somebody like Winnicott spoke about a personal superego.
Okay.
So a personal superego would be, moral principles that you actually believe in and that you actually think are good principles to follow. And it would also be um, your own norms to some extent. In other words, Winnicott was allowing for there to be an objective morality, a morality that human beings are wired, so to speak, to honor and helps them to grow as people, and also that we can have our own standards as well, because as you know, Winnicott was very much a man that espoused the importance of play, which is
Yes.
also to do with art, for example, or art in the main. And art would be also about cultivating your own individuality. So with Freud, you haven't got the sense of an objective morality, and you haven't got the sense of, um, your own standards that allow you to become your own person as well.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's a real bind. I
Why I
mean,
see is impoverished.
Indeed, yeah. Well, I mean, and I'm just kind of wondering because obviously he is, he is seeing this guilt, this kind of phenomenon, part of the discontentment of civilized life, this kind of all pervasive guilt that people are struggling with, and he's suggesting, I think that. I mean, there's a quote here actually. He says, "When an instinctual trend undergoes repression, its libidinal elements are turned into symptoms and its aggressive components into a sense of guilt." So, I mean, do you think essentially this he's overstating the degree of guilt that's going on out there? Actually, I mean, aside from whether his conception of the superego is quite plausible,
Well, I think that might be a bit difficult to discern because, Freud, as you would expect, um, espoused this idea of an unconscious sense of guilt.
okay,
So
yeah,
for Freud, you could have a conscious sense of guilt, the pain of having done something wrong, and you're aware of it. But he also had this view that you might not consciously feel guilty, but you have an unconscious sense of guilt, and that may lead you to doing things that are counterproductive as a form of punishment. Now, I mean, it does seem credible to me that you can have an unconscious sense of guilt, and of course, you might think, well, the unconscious sense of guilt. Well, how strict is that superego for to have that sense? And it seems to be, as far as Freud's concerned, that if you've got a particularly strict punitive superego, you're more likely to have an unconscious sense of guilt, actually.
yeah,
That it might, almost like some of it can't even be consciously contemplated because it's so painful.
sure,
So when you say how much do we feel guilt, I think you hear about the inner critic a lot in therapy. That would be a harsh superego. And then if there is such a thing as unconscious guilt, then yes, I think it is quite going to be quite a pervasive phenomenon. But because he doesn't acknowledge that there is also conscience, in that regard, he will underestimate the degree of guilt because he's not actually recognizing that there are other kinds of guilt. There's punitive guilt, which is not authentic conscience guilt.
yeah,
Um, so in that way, he downplays
mm,
that guilt. He actually underestimates that guilt because he doesn't recognize or discuss its existence. Um, I mean,
interesting,
I think obviously for Freud, and we'll won't go into it in any great depth because it's about him and religion, but I think that he probably felt that if we start acknowledging that there's an objective morality that humans want to align themselves with, that could be getting into, for him, dangerous territory, into, because one of the arguments for a god is the existence of objective morality.
sure,
Now, that's another issue altogether. But I think, if he saw us as animals with our instincts, and then we had these instinctual explanations for guilt, we don't have to really deal with objective morality. But then, if you don't see that, then you're downplaying conscience guilt,
yes, yeah.
authentic guilt, which I think does exist too.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, so his his sense of, obviously, coming from his role in the therapy room, that he was encountering guilt a lot. It's interesting that may be true, and it may be partly true for the reasons that he was putting forward. But yeah, maybe in a sense, there were other explanations for this guilt that don't quite fit into the system.
Yeah, but I think he was kind of holding to an inconsistent position, because I remember reading that Reich had said that he had discussed some matter with Freud, and Freud had said to him, "I didn't know that you had such a rigid superego," as an observation, because Freud, understandably thought that a rigid superego was not a healthy psychological entity.
Yes. Yeah.
What it would do to the psyche. But the thing is, if you start talking about a rigid superego as a problem, then you've got to think about a healthier version. And I don't really know how you posit a healthier version without thinking about a conscience and a more authentic, objective morality.
Yeah, it's true.
To be honest.
Yeah, you're right. Exactly. I mean, I suppose, given the irrational kind of superego that Freud is suggesting, and obviously the desirability for individual happiness, for people to actually just lower its demands, well, does that mean that it's just unchecked egotism as the alternative?
Well, exactly. I mean, surely he would not have believed that a superego that was lax or non-existent was an improvement, because I mean that's what psychopaths have.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
So, or people that are what we would call hedonistic in the pejorative sense, and the idea that that was then something that therapy would take you to, that can't be to my mind, that cannot be a legitimate, credible therapeutic aim.
And, in fact, and to be fair, actually, because, his views on aggression, I think at another point in the book, he describes aggression, human aggressiveness, as the greatest, risk to others, the greatest argument for civilization. It is a bit of a diabolical bind he has us in here, because obviously a superego is needed to contain that aggression. But, by its very nature, it's a pretty unpleasant and guilt-inducing entity that we have to then live with for the sake of everybody else. So, that, I mean, again, obviously, discontentment with a capital D, really, if that's the bind that we're in, really. Yeah.
Well, it is, and as we were saying, the idea that a more lax superego is the model of health is a bit questionable. But then it might be possible that Freud just thought that it wasn't really an ideal, but more just a resigned alternative. A bit like how he said therapy was taking you from neurotic misery to ordinary unhappiness.
Yeah. Well, it seems like that. I mean, I think, he's depicting a kind of trade-off, I guess, between individual happiness and social cohesion here. And so, yeah, I suppose if you went to the one extreme of individual happiness, in this kind of conception, you've just abandoned the superego and any kind of social restraint. So from an individual point of view, well, that's like how he is, as far as I can see, depicting happiness. But again, that doesn't necessarily sound like a terribly happy place to be, as you said. I mean, you might be a sociopath, yeah.
No, and I mean the thing is that Freud in his own life could be particularly moral in some regards anyway. We know, for example, that he turned down his nephew's offer, Edmund Bernays, had offered him to write some article to make a buck.
Yep.
And that was antithetical to how Freud, looked at things. That, of course, he wanted to make a bit of money, but he was not capitalistic to that degree, really. So again, is he saying that this was just some norm he was following in his superego that didn't have any objective legitimacy? I doubt it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, to me, I can't really believe that any credible model of psychological maturity makes out that happiness is disregarding our impact on others. I think it has to include that.
I mean, I absolutely agree.
For our own happiness too.
Yes, exactly,
I find
exactly.
that hard to believe, really. Or if that's what he thought, I don't think that's the case.
It doesn't sound like that was how he lived his life, as you said. So it does seem a little bit like,
No, he was
did he?
quite principled in some ways,
Yeah.
really there. So,
I wonder then,
um,
because I mean, obviously, there's a link. The next question we're going to talk about kind of follows on from that one, actually, because he's at one point he brings up, the again the age he was in, the communist,
hmm,
perspective on society was obviously kind of in the air, and we'd obviously the Russian Revolution would have happened prior to this book and so on. He's critical in the book of what he would see as the kind of psychological naivety
hmm,
of the communist view about what civilization should become. He doesn't
hmm,
share, the kind of Rousseau-like view, the kind of,
no.
idealized view of pre-civilized man. So, the question really was, what do you infer from this book then, according to Freud, is kind of the right amount of civilization that's actually good for us?
Yeah, well, the when I read the book, particularly near the end, I got the impression that Freud kind of saw civilization a bit like that, how he conceived our own individual happiness. This idea of moving from neurotic misery to ennui and happiness. I didn't really think that Freud believed that there was a sweet spot. In other
Mm,
words, an ideal degree of civilization. I didn't get that impression at all
yeah.
from his book and from what I've read of him otherwise, that he thought that. I think he would probably think there would be a degree of civilization that would be adequate in some ways. But there's no notion of thriving
No.
uh, in this psychology. That would seem quite alien to how he talked about us and thought about human nature. It's not about thriving. So I don't think there is a sweet spot when it comes to civilization. I mean, actually, at one point in the book, near the end, I think, he says that, for those people that are very pessimistic and have the view that civilization isn't worth its salt, he
Mhm.
says he would listen to them without bridling. So it's almost as though,
Yeah.
he's not saying that that's his own position, but it's not something that he doesn't see any cogency to. So I think
Yeah.
I think the thing is there is a deep pessimism there. I think he was illustrating the problems as he saw it with civilization, maybe to just highlight um, why we can't really have that happiness, and at least we can then understand it. I mean, that could be a consolation, at least for the Freuds of this world, who value understanding so much.
Yes.
But how much it's a consolation for others, I don't know. I think he would agree it wouldn't be for many, that
Yeah, well,
perspective.
it's a very good point though, because I mean, just trying to kind of unpick his view. I mean, it's like on the one hand, he would Rousseau obviously talked about the corruption of certain kinds of civilization and how and again you could see, well, yeah, Freud could kind of go with that, but he didn't. He was more a Hobbesian in terms of what the state of
Yeah.
nature was like. So he had a it's like it's bleak in both directions, really. Because obviously individual gratification being, I suppose, synonymous with happiness, but yet in creatures that are very aggressive by nature,
Mm, mm.
just means a horror show in an uncivilized environment. But yeah, or a tremendously repressive, guilt-ridden kind of unhappiness of another form in a civilized environment. So yeah, it does seem pessimistic, and I think you're right. I mean, he does. I mean, he says that, as you like you said towards the end, he says he's not got any solution. He's not really going to speculate on the future, and he just kind of sees it more as like a tug of war, I guess, between the kind of pro individual egotistical kind of urges manifest in people, and then the more pro social controlling forces trying to keep them in check. But again,
Yeah.
the human being pulled between these two hasn't really got a great prospect in either way, actually. So yeah, you're right. It's like
No.
he is kind of implicitly suggesting a sort of compromise is all we can really have. A sort of civilization to a degree, but it's not a very affirmative compromise, really. It's a sort of best of a
Yeah.
bad lot, maybe. It's like that's what he's kind of saying.
Well, yes. I mean, I think that, he's saying that if we were in that state of nature, that we could have intense pleasure, but our lives would be very transient.
Yeah.
Whereas if we're a part of a civilization, then our lives are extended, but they may become more existences in a way.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and
Yep.
I think so that I think that was my sense of what his position was,
I think it is. Yeah.
and so he's agreeing with Rousseau that we're in chains, but he's saying that that's the best game in town, really, is to have those chains in a way, and that there's not going to be flourishing, thriving, or any sort of actualization, as the Maslow school would
Yeah.
see it.
Yes.
That and he says he's not going to be a prophet. In other words, he is not going to espouse some kind of utopia that we're
No.
heading towards. And I mean, it's not as though his perspective is totally wrong.
No. No.
I
No.
think I get the sense with Freud that he is such he idealizes the reality principle so much that it may mean that he sees the more pessimistic something is, the more realistic it is, if you
Hmm.
see what I mean. It
Yep.
might be that he almost fetishizes the pessimistic because he thinks that anything that is bleak and sober must be true.
I think so. Well, it's funny. I've got that quote here that you just alluded to. And again, it's got a real kind of poetic flourish to it because he says, I have not the courage to rise up before my fellow men as a prophet, and I bow to their reproach that I can offer them no consolation, for at bottom, that is what they are all demanding, the wildest revolutionaries no less passionately than the most virtuous believers.
Mm,
So there
mm.
is a kind of, he's taking, there's a sense he's quite enjoying the bleakness, actually, in terms of, I can't give you anything, other than sober reality here.
Yes,
as
yeah,
you, as
I
you,
think that's the thing. Yeah, the
yeah,
more sober and the more bleak it is, uh, the more it's true in a way.
yeah,
There's this idea that truth is pain, really, and I think that if you see reality as this antagonist to uh, the instincts as he does, then you can sort of see why reality is pain in a lot of ways.
yeah,
But I think it contaminates and distorts some of his reasoning in that. I have
yeah,
to say that when reading it again, that there was this most astonishing oscillation, between um him, when he was talking about certain things, he would talk about them with a degree of reserve. He would be equivocating. He would say it might be this, it might not be that, or it could be this up to an extent. And then at other times it swerved into certainty.
yes, yep,
This might be the sort of psychological poles that Freud oscillated from, from a kind of you know, considering all these different possibilities, being very reserved to being very much an advocate at
yeah.
other points. It's interesting.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I don't know if it really struck me the part where he has a little bit. I don't want to say a rant, but he talks a bit about the kind of Christian mantra, love thy neighbor as thyself, and he wants to highlight what he thinks of as the absurdity of that statement, being
Mm,
commanded to love your neighbor. Your neighbor might not be a very nice person, but
mm.
he kind of, to me, I would imagine most people would interpret that statement as meaning love your neighbor in a kind of more understanding way. It would be the sort of idea that you recognize your neighbor as a fellow suffering being, and you take that into account in your dealings with them. The love. I mean, maybe that's not the in terms of how those words were originally meant. Love thy neighbor as thyself. But I think people would probably make a case for it being a more you could almost translate it as have empathy for your neighbor as a fellow suffering creature.
Well,
You know,
yeah, but I think it can be interpreted that way. I think originally in the Christian sense, it's not. about empathy, but more love.
Yeah. Okay.
And Lacan, he actually said that, because he must have agreed with Freud, that it should be hate thy neighbor as thyself.
Right. Okay.
But I think that and this is something that Reich wrote about in his book on masochism as well. That I think what Freud was saying there is that love thy neighbor as thyself is not something that really accords with our psychological reality.
Yes.
And I think and there have been philosophers that have argued that you can't really choose to love. So this idea of choosing to love
Yeah.
others doesn't quite add up. But I think if you were going to be giving it its best profile showing, that you would
Yeah.
be saying it's approaching people in a spirit of generosity and openness and empathy.
Yeah. Yeah.
But again, only to some extent. And I think also Freud did make the astute point that it somewhat waters down the conception of love.
Yes.
Because the people that you do love, can you really say that you would want to love others, your neighbor, just intrinsically in the same way? So there can be a devaluing there as well. I think he was right about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think, yeah, in that sense, it's true. I mean, it's easy to kind of, point out that, if love is just, interpreted in that, kind of way, then yes, of course, that doesn't seem a very likely scenario. So, yeah, I mean, obviously his, it does kind. It's like a bit of a sort of straw man argument in favour of his kind of more, we're more aggressive creatures. How could that possibly
Well,
make it? Yeah,
exactly, because that maxim speaks about love, and that doesn't seem quite a credible way to approach dealing with acquaintances or neighbours. It seems a bit too positive, and unrealistic. That yes, it is a straw man argument for him, but yeah, he doesn't consider that healthy human beings do want to connect,
yeah,
and they
yeah,
do want to see other people as their fellow creatures. That sense of uh, community.
yeah.
He does not think about that. It doesn't seem to exist for him.
Yes.
So yes, he quite shrewdly picks something that he knocks down and then uses that as an argument for why we're more aggressive adversarial beings. A bit like this sort of view that Pinter would have had, in his plays anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you don't
That's right.
really get love thy neighbor as thyself in Pinter either, don't we?
No, no, that's for sure. Yeah. Yes. It's
So
interesting.
again, yeah, I mean, but I do think there is more fellow feeling for others than what he believes, than what Freud makes out there.
I think so. Yeah, I think maybe a statement like that, a more middling take on it, would maybe be the kind of what would be more typical. People might
More
not be
moderate, yeah.
shocked by the claim, or at least see a point to it. Although, yeah, I mean there is a problem obviously if it's just taken as literally as love your neighbor as much as you love yourself, your partner, the most treasured people in your life. Obviously, in that equivalent sense, that doesn't quite work.
Yeah, and I think another way in which that saying departs from psychological reality is that most people do not love themselves in any healthy way.
Yeah, yeah,
So
okay,
this idea of love, that it kind of makes out that we're loving ourselves in this beneficent way. I don't generally see that, and I'm not
yeah,
just talking about in the therapy room. And so again, it's starting from this assumption that we have this beneficent love towards ourselves, which we can then also redirect towards others. That seems to be quite a rare idea. I'm not
yeah,
saying it's impossible, but it is not. It is not common.
yes, no. I think you're right. Um,
Because most people don't love themselves.
no, well, no, indeed, and I mean, as we discussed earlier, in terms of the prevalence of guilt and these other you
Yeah.
know, yeah,
And I
well,
think,
yeah,
and I think Lacan was intimating that with hate thy neighbor as thyself. At least that
yes.
was closer to the psychological reality. I'm not
Well,
saying it's what we should adopt, but
but yeah, it does seem a little bit more plausible. You're quite right.
it
Yeah.
does, because I'm afraid self-hate is more common than self-love in a healthy sense.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. We had initially hoped to cover a couple of more questions about this book, but unfortunately the recording time got the better of us on this occasion. But we hope you enjoyed the conversation that we had, and thank you for listening.